Welcome everybody to today's webinar of 15 key rules for managing your organization's data. And before we get started, I'd just like to go through a few things and some housekeeping to make sure that everyone has at least all the access that they need to this webinar today. Quickly about ACGI, who is your host. ACGI Software, we're based out of Columbia, Maryland. We are product developers of two products that are cloud-based. One is an association management system called Association Anywhere. The other is called Threelegged, designed for credentialing organizations that may do certification or accreditation or some sort of licensure programs. Our customers are professional societies, trade associations, credentialing organizations, and we work with plenty of association management companies that represents those types of organizations. Wes is no stranger to ACGI and certainly no stranger to the association world. We're happy to have him back to present today's Knowledge Builder webinar. For nearly 30 years, Wes has worked in and with hundreds of associations, membership organizations ranging in size from no staff to over 700. He's most widely published author of data management in the association marketplace. You can find his writing in his weekly and monthly newsletter, which I receive, as well as dozens of other places on the web. Wes is the author of the book, Put Your Data to Work, 52 Tips and Techniques for Effectively Managing Your Database, and it's published by the ASAE. Prior to starting his own consulting firm, Effective Database Management, Wes has nearly 10 years experience working in associations as Director of Membership, Marketing, and Customer Service. So I'd like to take this opportunity, please welcome Wes Trochlil. And Wes, the floor is yours. I'm going to hand over the controls to you.
Oh, thanks again, Arj. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be here today, and welcome everyone. As Arj mentioned, I've worked in a consulting capacity for the past 20 years with several hundred associations. And the key rules that we're going to discuss today have been gleaned from my interaction with my clients over that time. These obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, and even though we're calling them rules, they're not really rules. You can do what you like, right? But I think these rules I've found through my clients' experience, those who execute any or most of these are going to do very well when it comes to managing their data. So let's jump right in. Before we talk about the rules themselves, there's one thing we need to keep in mind, and that is that this isn't just one thing, it's really three things. When we talk about managing our data, we're talking about the people who are involved, which of course is your staff, but increasingly, of course, it's also your members and customers. The simple fact is that if you've got a system that allows members to join online, renew, register for events, if they do anything online and they're interacting with you, they're actually helping you to manage the data. So the people involved there are certainly your staff, but also your members and customers. The second piece, of course, is process, and process is what we're going to focus on today. It's how you do things. And then the third leg of the stool really is the technology. You've probably all seen this before, people, processing, technology. And where these three intersect is where you're going to have your ideal operations, where things are firing on all cylinders. And I raise this point because when we talk about these 15 rules, again, most of them are going to focus on process. But the reality is that the people who are executing these processes have to be engaged and well-trained, and the technology that you're using to support this has to support it in a way that allows you to implement these processes. So as we work through these, and as you think about these back in your own organization, think about those other two elements of the three-legged stool, the people and the technology, and if any changes need to be made there. So with that big caveat, let's jump in, look at rule number one. And for me, rule number one is that there is no stasis in data management. You may have heard the phrase, a business is either growing or it's dying. Well, the same thinking really applies to data management. Either your data is getting better, perhaps incrementally, but it's getting better, or it's getting worse. There really is no middle ground when it comes to managing data. And that can be illustrated by these two images here. This first image is what I call the cycle of doom. And the cycle of doom looks like this. the data is perceived as bad by your users, by your staff. And so as a result of that, your staff will start creating what I call shadow databases. And we'll talk a little bit later about shadow databases, but they're creating these lists outside of your primary system, maybe in spreadsheets, maybe in Outlook groups, maybe in a simple access database, but they're creating lists and managing lists outside of your primary system because they perceive the data in the primary system to be bad. The result of that, of course, is that as the data is being used and as the data is being updated, it's being updated in those shadow databases, not in the primary system. And as a result of that, of course, the data continues to get worse. You can see that you've got a self-fulfilling prophecy here. The data is bad, therefore I won't use it, therefore the data is bad. That's the cycle of doom. The flip side of that is what I call the cycle of virtue, which is we've got good, high quality data that we find very useful. And as a result, we actually do use that data from the primary system. We use it for marketing, for communications. We analyze that data and we use it for product development, things like that. As a result of that data being used, the data is continually cleaned and updated. So if you send out a broadcast email and you get email bounces, that information gets fed back to the system and those emails get updated over time and so on, just as an example. But the point is then this, again, self-fulfilling prophecy of the data is good, we'll use the data continues to be good. And so again, there's no stasis here. You're either on the left side or the right side. Either you're in that cycle of doom or you're in a virtuous cycle. And Arj, here's where I'd like to pause and throw up our poll question if we can do that.
Sure thing. That's okay. It should be enabled right now.
All right. So you can see the quick poll here is which data management cycle does your association most closely resemble? So either you're in the cycle of doom or cycle of virtue. There's no other choice you can make. You can't be in the middle. So if you just choose that and hit submit, and we can see what the results are.
I'm going to give you about 20 more seconds here because it looks like people are still selecting.
Very good.
Still going. We've got 5 more seconds, still going. Oh, people are thinking about this. Okay, I'll give you about 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, still going. 1. Okay, let's share this with the audience, Wes, and hopefully you can see this. If not, let me know and I'll read it.
Yes, I can. So this is great. The results are 51% cycle of doom, 49 cycle of virtue. So we're split right down the middle, which I find kind of fascinating. Well, so again, that's kind of my setup here for the rest of the session, is to think about where you are. If you're in that cycle of doom, my hope would be that you can apply one or more of these rules that we go through for the rest of the session and help you to get out of that cycle of doom. If you're in the cycle of virtue, maybe some of these tips will help you go even further and even continue to improve what you've got. So got a split field here. That's very interesting. Okay, so given that, let's move on to our next rule. Where did my clicker's gone? There we go. Rule number 2 is to create data entry guidelines and user guides. Now, in my mind, these are actually 2 different documents. The data entry guidelines is going to be a fairly simple document that outlines what data goes into what fields and how that data should be entered. And so what I mean by that is, as an example, you've got your address 1 field. What is the rule for how your organization enters data in that field? Do you spell out street? Is it ST period? Is it just ST? Do you do all caps? I don't have any clients who do all caps anymore, but there was a time when we did that. But what is the rule for entering data into that given field? And extending that a bit further, if you have fields that are quote unquote custom to your organization, demographics fields, for example, things that you collect that maybe no other association collects, you need to define those fields as well so that, again, the users understand what those fields are used for. I can't tell you how many times I've run into organizations where they'll say, this field is labeled email, but we actually use it to track areas of interest. Which is, I guess, fine, except that the label doesn't match what it's used for, and that's going to be confusing to users. So your data entry guidelines define how the field itself is used. The user's guide, on the other hand, actually tells us how we are processing data through the system. And so if you think about a membership join or renewal, think about an event registration or an event cancellation, anything like that, that's a process. We need to have that documented so that any staff person who is processing data in the system is processing it in the same way as other staff members are. You've probably heard the term GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. One of the reasons we get garbage in and garbage out is because we don't have our processes clearly defined, and as a result, different staff members process data in different ways. And again, because they're processing data in different ways, you're getting different results as it comes out. So it's really important that you've got these users guides available so staff understands how data is to be processed. And one thing to keep in mind here is I'll be the first to admit, having done this as a staff person as well as a consultant, creating these guidelines and these user guides is really tedious work. It's not, in my opinion anyway, it's not fun, but it's really critical to do. And in my experience, even though it's very time consuming and tedious, you will spend less time creating users guides than you will having to clean up after yourself if you don't have the guides. So the cost for doing these users guides is actually less than the cost for cleaning up after the fact. So think about what you've got in your organization in terms of what is documented, and make sure you've reviewed that documentation. That has to be updated over time, and make sure that staff understands where it is and that it's available to them. So rule number 3 is training, and that actually ties in nicely with the documentation we just talked about. When it comes to systems, especially association management systems, the reality is that most of these systems are managing fairly complex sets of data. Even if you have very simple business rules in terms of your membership, if you're doing events registration, or if you're doing product sales, especially if you're doing certification or other online learning, for example, that stuff gets really complicated really quickly. And being able to manage that in data internally, especially for staff, you can't expect staff to teach themselves. You can't expect them to sit down in front of the computer and learn. And so you need to have training available. That training might come from your vendor if you're using an off-the-shelf system, or you might have training capabilities internally, but you need to have training available to staff so that they can learn how to use the system. And related to training, there are a couple things you should keep in mind. The first is, think about what I would call remedial training, and remedial just means training that you have to repeat over time. Very often I see organizations where they're running a process maybe only once or twice a year. I've had clients, for example, who only do one event per year. And so learning how to set up the event and run the event happens only once a year. And so you have to retrain for that each time. Some of my clients only send out membership dues once a year, maybe 3 notices, but it's only done on a calendar basis. And therefore, when it's time to rerun those renewal notices the next year, staff has forgotten. And that's what training and the documentation is going to support, making sure that staff understands how to do these things. And then a couple other things I think to keep in mind. First is that when you do training, you should be training only in what I call a sandbox environment or a test environment. Never ever train, if you can avoid it, never train in a live environment. And the primary reason is this: if you have someone learning in a live environment and they know they're in the live environment, they actually aren't going to learn much, because the only thing going through their mind as you're teaching them is, I hope I don't screw something up and, I don't know, delete the board of directors or delete these invoices or ruin an event, whatever it is. Your learners are thinking about what they shouldn't do rather than thinking about what they should do in the system. So if you have a sandbox or test environment, that's where the training should be done. And if you don't, talk to your vendor about that, because you should be able to get access to one. And then one last thought on training. Clearly this training is focused on how to use the system, but I've learned over time that one of the things that many associations don't realize is that staff, broadly speaking, actually doesn't really know everything that goes on in the database itself, meaning they don't understand all the data that's already being collected by the association. And this was brought home to me several years ago when I was working with a very large association as they were rolling out their new enterprise system. And we had done training throughout the organization, many different departments. And one woman who had attended my training, she went back to her office. Her boss said to her, how was the training? She said it was great. But to her, one of the neatest things was that she learned about what other departments were doing, what other data was in the system. And this kind of set a light bulb off for her boss, who said, you know, I don't know everything that's in that system, and I bet a lot of my peers don't. And so what they did was they coordinated what they called a senior management training. It was really a database awareness training for their senior managers, which I conducted for them. And we had about 20 people in the room. And as we were walking through all the data that was collected in the database, we got to a certain screen where we were talking about demographic data collected about the members. And there was an audible gasp from the back of the room. And one of the vice presidents said, "We just spent 2 weeks developing a survey to send to our members next week to collect that data that we already have in our system. We just didn't know about it." So the good news is they had the data and they wouldn't have to embarrass themselves by asking their members for the same information. The bad news, of course, is they had spent 2 weeks on something they didn't need to spend time on. But the point is, very often, even in smaller organizations, staff is not aware of the breadth of data that's being captured by the organization. And so doing these data awareness trainings once or twice a year can be really effective, especially ensuring that we're not trying to collect data that we already have, we're not spinning our wheels on data that we shouldn't be collecting. So rule number 4 is that testing is critical. So testing, when I talk about testing, what I mean is the idea that if you implement a new procedure or process with your system, if you're implementing a new system, if you're implementing something maybe that's been customized by your vendor, whatever it is, you need to test that before you roll it out to the live environment to make sure that it's actually working as you would expect it to. If you ask any of the vendors, the AMS vendors that I work with, if you ask them what's the single likeliest cause of failure or great angst or pain in a new system rollout, they'll tell you that the testing wasn't completed efficiently or effectively enough. And so when you think about any change in your processes, I mentioned the test database or the sandbox earlier, that should be implemented in your sandbox. You should be testing it to make sure that it's working as you would have expected. Because as I like to tell my clients, testing occurs either before you go live or after you go live. The testing before go live is done by staff. The testing after go live is done by your customers. And so you get to decide who's going to do that testing. And I would submit that staff testing is better than customer testing. So always keep that in mind as you roll out new ideas, new processes, new technology, new functionality within your AMS. Make sure that it has been tested and performs in a way that you expect. Rule number 5, eliminate shadow systems. I mentioned shadow systems in that first rule about the cycle of doom. And what shadow systems are any list of data that is actively managed outside of your primary system. So it's not in your primary AMS, but someone's got a spreadsheet or an Outlook group or something else where they've got data and they're actually actively managing it. And what I mean by that is, as data is updated or changes, they actually update it in those spreadsheets or in the Outlook group. Those are shadow systems. The most common offender of this, in my experience, is the list of the board of directors. I would guess at least half of my clients at some point or another, when I'm talking to them, will say, "Oh yeah, we have our board of directors in a spreadsheet because that's really important. We have to make sure it's managed right." And then I'll say, "Well, aren't your board of members also members of the association? They're already in the AMS, right?" "Yeah, but we've got it over in this spreadsheet also." And so either they're managing it in both places, or what's really usually happening is they're managing it on the spreadsheet, and then whatever happens in the database happens in the database. But that's an example of a shadow system, and it's one you have to be really, really aware of, because even with my very best clients, the clients who I think are managing their data really super effectively, they still have this issue. Shadow systems, like weeds, always pop up. Someone always has a reason for doing something outside of the system. And so you need to identify where that's occurring, identify who is doing that, and of course, most importantly, understand and identify why they're doing it. Why is it they have to manage that data outside of the primary system? And what can we do to get that data back into the primary system and get them managing that data back in the primary system? So look around your organization. My suspicion is that you've got shadow systems already. You may already even know about them, and you need to work really hard to eliminate them because they can wreak all kinds of havoc in terms of keeping your data really clean. And like I said at the beginning, shadow systems are one of the symptoms of that cycle of doom. So keep your eye out for those. Rule number 6 is one of my favorites, and that is don't manage to the exception. The thing I love about associations, I worked in associations for 10 years as Director of Membership and Marketing and Customer Service, and one of the things I love about associations is they tend to be very egalitarian. We like to treat everybody as equals, and I think that's a great thing. The problem is that it can also be a bit of a trap for us, because what we do is we listen to everything that everybody is saying, and people will say things like, I don't like how this is done, you should do it this way. It could be a board member speaking, for example, and then we say, okay, that's what we'll do, we'll manage it that way. And the reality is that what they're suggesting is something that doesn't happen very often. Maybe it happens to them, but it doesn't happen to most of your members. And now we've created a rule designed to capture what happens very rarely, as opposed to a rule that is designed to capture what happens most frequently. So we want to make sure that all of our business rules are designed to capture or designed to address what happens most often. And I want to give you a couple of examples from my clients to illustrate what I mean here. One association I worked with represented, their membership was a specific type of lawyer. So you had to practice a specific type of law to be a member of that association. And that's a perfectly legitimate thing. Obviously, different associations are serving different members, and we've got rules about who can be a member, and there's nothing wrong with that. So as a result of that, they had to, rather than you just being able to join and give money and be a member, you had to actually join as an application. There was a committee that would review the application, and then they would approve your membership or not. And so at the time when I was working with them, what that meant was if someone joined online, they would fill out the form online. That would get submitted to staff. Staff would forward that on to the committee who would review it. Then the committee would tell the staff whether or not they were approved. And if they were approved, then the staff would create an invoice and send that invoice to the still prospective member and say, pay this invoice, and then you'll be a member. And once payment was received, they were a member. Well, the problem, at least from my perspective, was that at the time, that process was taking up to 60 days. So that if Wes decided that he wanted to join the association today, it would be the end of September before I actually got to be a member. Now there's a application and approval process that's required, but to my mind, 60 days is way too long, especially nowadays. So the question is, what could we do to make that better? And the first thing that popped into my mind was, why do we have to invoice after the fact? Why can't we make them pay as they join, so that once they're approved by the committee, we can immediately turn them on, and we don't have to send an invoice, wait for payment, and so on. And the director of membership at the time, she responded, well, our refund process is really laborious, really cumbersome, and I don't want to get into refunds. So if someone paid and then I had to say, you're not a member, I'd have to refund them, and it's just a hassle. I said, well, I guess that sounds okay. Let me ask you a question. How many members join every year? And she thought about that. She said, it's probably about 100 members a year. And I said, well, of those, how many does the committee actually reject? And she thought about it for a second, and she got a smile on her face, and she said, usually it's about 2. And so she had developed a rule where she said, we will bill everybody because we don't want to do refunds, when in fact refunds are what happens 2% of the time. 98% of the time the member gets approved. So accepting the money up front was not a problem at all, because that money wasn't going to be refunded. But those are the kind of traps we can fall into, because we perceive certain things as really difficult to do, and therefore we want to avoid those, when in fact, very often it's not terribly difficult to do, and it's not happening that often. So we need to be careful about falling into that trap. Another great example, I worked with an association that had an event that had about 1,000 registrants for the event. And of those registrants, about 200 of them were group registrations. And for them, group registrations had been a bit of a sticking point, because they had a kind of a funky rule that said for every 5 that paid full, the 6th one would go for free. And so very often their members would take advantage of this and send 20 people. And so, the first 15 were full paid, and the next 3 are free, and then so on. And their current system wouldn't support that. The new system they were looking at wouldn't really support that. And we were kind of going back and forth about how much time and money do we want to spend on this to customize this. And my first thought was, is this an exception or not? Well, 200 out of 1,000 is 20%, so that's fairly significant. So maybe it's not exceptional. But then it dawned on me, we're talking about group registrations. And so I asked, when the group registers, how many people will be in that group? Is it usually 5 or 6? And they said, no, usually it's closer to 20. So when the group registration comes through, it's 20 people, which if we do the quick math means it's probably about 10 to 12 registration forms. It just happens to account for 200 people. So now we've gone from 1,000 registrations, 12 of which are these painful ones, and the rest are individual registrations. And so now we're back to, that's fairly exceptional. 12 could probably be handled by staff. Granted, it's not easy, it's not fun, but it's better than all the time and expense to really address that, which is very much an exception. So again, think about the rules that you've established, your business rules, and how you're managing data, and make sure that you haven't developed some kind of rule that is really exceptional, because managing to the exception becomes very expensive and frankly very confusing, and is usually not worth the effort. All right, moving right along here. Rule number 7 is to bring key data into the primary AMS. And so what I mean by this is a couple things. First is key data means that implies that there are systems outside of the primary system that we're actually using by choice. These are not shadow systems I'm talking about. These are actually third-party systems that we've identified we're going to use, and they have some key data that we would want back in the primary AMS. And so the best examples of that are, very often my clients will use third-party event registration tools, say Cvent or Eventbrite or Reg Online, or they might also use a third-party registration company if they have a big annual conference, for example. And so there's data being collected by that system, those registration systems that we might want back in the primary AMS. Other good examples are learning management systems or grassroots management systems. These are systems that, again, are not shadow databases because we've agreed that we are going to use them. As an organization, we said we're using this. It's not one person off doing their own thing. As an organization, we said we're going to use these third-party systems, but there's probably very likely going to be key data in those systems that we need to bring back into the primary system. And so what is that key data? Well, that's part of what you have to have a conversation about. But as a simple example, let's say it's a registration system. The key data might be something as simple as Wes signed up for this event, for the annual conference. So we want to make sure that's back on his primary record so that we can see that Wes is a member who actually attends our annual conference. If it's a learning management system, it might be credits that are earned that need to be brought into the primary AMS. If it's a grassroots system, it might be Wes participated in these grassroots activities and we want that back in the primary AMS. And there are a couple of reasons we want that information or might want that information back in the primary AMS. And those really are typically related to marketing and customer service. And I'll give you an example of what I mean just from my own personal experience as an association member. I've been a member of ASAE for the past 25 years. And in that time, I've written a bunch for them. I've spoken a bunch for them. I've volunteered for them a whole lot. And these days, if I go on and log on my profile, I can see all that activity. They've done a very good job of aggregating that information so that as a member, I can see how I've been engaged. And of course, that means the staff can see that as well. But there was a time many years ago, this probably goes back at least 10 years now, maybe 15 years actually. But I was volunteering for them, going to speak at an event, and I was working with a staff person. I think she was relatively new. And at that time, I'd already been volunteering with ASA for 8 or 10 years, and I had spoken at a bunch of events and so on. But when she contacted me, the first question she asked me was, have you ever spoken for us before? Now, as a volunteer, I find that question deeply offensive because of course I've spoken for you. What do you think I've been doing? I've been doing this for free for 8 or 10 years, and you're asking me if I've done it or not? You should know that. And it should be frankly embarrassing to you to have to ask that question. So think about that from the perspective of your members and customers. You should never be in a position where you're asking them for data that they've already provided you, especially if it's data that they've provided you multiple times. So in my case, I had spoken for ASA many times, and so that was a question she never should have asked because I've done it more than once. By that time, I'd done it a dozen times. So that's why we want to make sure that we understand what those third-party systems are and what the key data is and what data should be brought back into the primary system. Hey, Arj, I'm going to pause here for a second and see, are there any burning questions in the question section?
Well, we do have quite a few questions coming in. I don't want to take you off track. Would you like to get them? We have some questions here. I can get into it right now. Or
you can throw one at me and then we'll jump back.
Okay, let's just throw you a softball. Can you talk about which
Sure.
is better, a training environment or a simulations for training? Is one better? Can both be incorporated? Thank you, Dan, for that question.
And so what was the first? It was
Yeah, it said, can you talk about which is better, a training environment or simulations for training? Is one better than the other, or can both be incorporated? So.
Yeah, so I would say both. Definitely, obviously, we're going to walk users through how to use the system, but the best way to train, in fact, I've written about this on my blog, and there's even I even have a training MP3 recording that I did several years ago, a webinar, and if people want to email me for that, I'll be glad to send that to them for free. But one of the keys to training is tell them what you're going to do it, and then tell them what you did. And added in there would be those, what I would call scenario-based training, where when you say, okay, we're learning how to run a membership, you actually give them an example, a sample that the learner would then process him or herself. So they are getting that hands-on experience with the system. So it isn't just tell me what to do, it's show me how to do it, let me do it, and then let's talk about what we learned there. Okay, I'm gonna jump back in if that's all right.
Okay.
All right, so keep the questions coming. Rule number 8 is to capture what I call non-financial, non-volunteer interactions. And so this is really critical here. Non-financial, your AMS presumably is already capturing the financial transactions, so we're not talking about that. And non-volunteer, what I mean by that is interactions that are not related to volunteerism. You should be capturing that already. You should know, using my example, you should know when your members or customers have spoken with you, have written for you, have served on committees. You should know all that. That information should already be there. So what I'm referring to is non-financial, non-volunteer interactions that have value. And so I'll give you a couple of quick examples here. The first is that I'm hearing more and more from my association clients, they want to know what other departments are doing with the members so that when the staff talk to members, they are fully informed of the engagement that's going on. And one of the best examples I hear is if your executive director or your senior staff actually meets with members on a regular basis, which a lot of my clients do, those engagements, those interactions should be captured in your AMS so that you can see as a staff person, oh, I see that our executive director met with this company last week, so that when I'm talking to them today, I already know that. So you have to think about what are the non-financial, non-volunteer interactions that are occurring, and how can you capture those within your AMS? What are the useful ones? And again, this gets back to documentation and training, because you're going to have to identify what those useful ones are, and then you're going to have to identify what the process is for capturing that. I won't say this is easy, but I will say that my clients who do this have done it with tremendous effect, and so it's a really important one to keep in mind. Rule number 9 is to create what I call data integrity reports. Now, a data integrity report is simply a report that allows you to identify potentially erroneous data within the system. And so what do I mean by that? A perfect and simple example is, think about an email address. So if you're going to have a field within your database, that's email, and an email address must have an @ symbol in its email for it to be even potentially correct. It could still be a bad email, but if it doesn't have an @ symbol in it, we know for a fact it will not deliver. So that is in fact a truly bad email. And so you could create a report or query that says, show me any records where the email address does not have an @ symbol. And then you're going to find all those records that have garbage in that field, and you can clean that up. That's a simple example of a data integrity report. And again, these reports are designed to help you identify potentially bad data. And so I've worked with several associations who do this really well. One organization that was a trade association, and the membership director there, a database manager, she had a whole series of data integrity reports that she ran either daily, weekly, monthly, or twice yearly to check data to find those potentially bad data points. So one she ran, I think on a weekly basis, was no email address, because it was possible for data to get entered into the system without an email address. And so she would find those records and then work on updating that. On the flip side, if it had a record in the system that had no physical mailing address, she would identify those, and then they would have a process for figuring out how to update that information. They were a trade association, so each member had to have a primary contact, but of course there were occasions where a primary contact might leave the company and that information would be reflected, but they may not have found out who the new primary contact is. And so she could run a report that said, show me all my members who do not have a primary contact associated with the company record. And then she would identify those, and they would have a process for updating that data. Those are really great examples. In a sense, they're very simple, but they're very, very powerful reports, because I talk a lot about weeding the garden when it comes to data management. Going back to that first slide again, if you're working on weeding the garden, finding the garbage, so to speak, in your database and cleaning that up, you're going to create more value in that system and create more trust among your staff. And data integrity reports are a really, really powerful way to do that, because again, by definition, you're cleaning up the data as you go. All right, rule number 10, another one of my favorites, is to start an internal users group. If you are using an off-the-shelf system, like ACGI software is a good example, they have a user group of their clients, associations that use the software, and they have every, I think, 18 months, they have an annual conference where the users actually come together, all the different associations who use ACGI software, and they meet to discuss what's going on with the company and the product and so on. So that's an external users group, and those are really important. If you're using an off-the-shelf system, I strongly encourage you to get involved in your external users group, because those are really valuable organizations. Here I'm talking about an internal users group. And so what I mean by that is the staff at your organization who use the system, having them meet on a regular basis to discuss everything that's going on within the database. First and foremost, this is to open the lines of communication within your organization, because again, going back to that example of the senior management training, for example, very often we work in our silos and we know what happens in our world, and we do not know what's happening outside, even if outside is literally down the hall and maybe right next to us. And an internal users group provides that opportunity for you to discuss what's going on, what changes are occurring, what challenges we're having. Are we running into weird errors that the software is throwing at us? Have we had a particularly big problem with certain data points? Do we have a new initiative coming up that's actually going to create new data? Whatever it is, you have an agenda, you meet, you talk about these things, and you address the issues as you go. This was really driven home. The value of this was really driven home to me a couple of years ago by one of my clients who had called me in to help them with their current setup. Their CFO called me and she said, I have a new executive director and some new senior staff, and they want to get rid of our current database, but I've invested over $1 million in the system, and I'm not convinced that we have a technology issue. I think it might be something else. And so I came in and we looked at that, and there definitely were issues about how this data was being used in their processes, and we addressed all that. And one of the recommendations I made was an internal users group. Well, about 6 months later, she called me to give me an update on how things are going. And she said, I have to tell you that the single best piece of advice you gave me was starting this internal users group, because since we worked with you and started that group, I've eliminated about 80% of my problems, because now the two departments that were having the biggest issues in terms of data being quote unquote messed up are talking to each other, and they're aware of what the other department is doing, and they're addressing those challenges. And so again, just by opening those lines of communication and talking about what is being done in the system, they were able to successfully overcome things that had literally had challenged them for years. And so I would suggest to you, think about, even if you're a small organization, think about an internal users group, who would be involved in that. I recommend meeting at least twice a month. If you can meet every week, that's probably even better, to talk about, again, everything that's going on, because the more informed your users are, especially about what's going on around the organization, the better off you're going to be, and the more likely that data is going to be continually cleaned, which is always our goal. Okay, rule number 11 is to practice database PR, public relations. Now here's the maybe not so secret about database management. Those of you who do it, you know it, and that is this: nobody cares until there's a problem. In other words, if the database is humming along just fine, nobody's paying any attention. But as soon as there is some kind of error, the board of directors list is wrong, our board chairman's email address is wrong, whatever it is, they come and scream at you, right? That's what happens with data management. It's very similar to, if you think about finance and payroll, when you get paid once a month or once every 2 weeks, that money goes right into your bank account, direct deposit, everything's fine. It's unlikely that you go down to finance every 2 weeks and say, thank you for paying me. However, the moment that payroll doesn't go through, everyone is at finance's door. And the same thing applies when it comes to data management. No one cares about what you're doing until it's wrong. And so we need to flip that and do our database public relations to keep our work in the forefront of people's minds and to keep them aware of what it is we're doing that is working and that is positive. And one of my favorite examples came from a client of mine who just once a month, he would write a 3 or 4 paragraph email sent to all staff explaining what was being done in the database, what they had accomplished over that past month. For example, how email delivery and snail mail delivery bounce back rates were, whether if they had a new data collection initiative going on, what that was, new initiatives, whatever it was. He just talked briefly about those things, but again, always with a positive spin, talking about the things that are working well in the system. And I know, having worked with that organization, at the time, the database did not have a very good reputation until he came in and started working on these things, including this database PR. But this was all brought home for him one day when one of his biggest critics, I shouldn't say his critic, it was really, she was a critic of the database itself and the data. One of the biggest critics happened to see him in the lunchroom, and she stopped and said, I have to tell you, the data is really impressive. You've done a great job cleaning things up, and you've really turned this around. And I asked him if he thought it was the PR, his monthly missive that contributed to that. And he said that probably helped, but she also had maybe changed her medication, so that might have helped as well. But the point is, he was delivering this news in a regular manner and talking about the things that are working positively. And that's something we have to do because, like I said, nobody cares until it's wrong. Number 12, be aware of indirect costs. So when we think about managing data and the technology that's involved with that, very often we think about and discuss the direct costs. How much will it cost to implement this software? How much will it cost for this customization? How much will it cost to collect this data? How much will it cost to clean up the data? And what we're talking about there is, kind of the literal dollar expense. What's the bill going to be for that? And those are the direct costs. And obviously those are important. But very often we overlook the indirect costs when it comes to managing the data or changing our technology or improving our technology. And so one good example is that documentation that I talked about earlier. The direct cost there, of course, is it takes time at least, if not money, for staff to write up that documentation. The indirect cost is that if you don't do it, you're likely to have garbage in, garbage out, and your data is going to get become bad, and you're going to slip into that cycle of doom if you're not already there. And that's the indirect cost we don't think about. Another really good example came from a client of mine who, when I asked her, do you think the technology you're using currently has an impact on staff? And she said her eyes got really big, and she said, it's very interesting you asked that, because just last week, I had an exit interview with one of my staff. This was a small staff organization, and she had 3 staff leave in the past year, which I think accounted for probably 30% of her staff. And that staff person had said to her, one of the reasons I'm leaving is because our technology is so bad that I can't do my job. And what was happening was the indirect cost of not changing technology was outweighing the direct cost of changing the technology. In other words, anyone who knows that it's very expensive to replace staff. And by saying, well, we'll update the technology next year because we don't have the money for it now, the indirect cost of that was that staff was actually, in this case, actually leaving the organization because the technology was so bad. So when you think about decisions you're making about how you manage your data, whether it is people, process, or technology, we always think about the direct costs, but think about the indirect costs. What will it cost if you do something? What are the indirect costs? And what are the indirect costs if you do not do something? You need to be aware of both of those. Number 13, we have to acknowledge that mistakes will be made. When I start an implementation of a new system, for example, with a client, one of the very first things I say to them is, we need to acknowledge right now that decisions we make today will be based on the best information we have. But 6 months or a year from now, we may decide that that was the wrong decision. It may be right now, but it was wrong a year from now. The benefit of hindsight allows that. But we have to acknowledge that we will make incorrect choices at certain points, because how we react to that is what matters most. Too often what happens if a decision turns out to be wrong is we start talking about, well, who's to blame for that? Why was this mistake made, and so on, instead of saying, look, we made that decision based on what we knew at the time. Now we have new information and we're changing how we do things. And so it's how you react to those mistakes that actually matter the most. And this was really brought home to me by a client of mine who sent me an email just recently. We were talking about the system they had implemented, and we were talking about what was working and what wasn't working. And here's what she said. I'm just going to read just a couple sentences what her email said in part. She said, it's so hard to set up a new database and decide how or where you want to track information when you don't have a really good understanding of the database and how different fields or screens relate to each other. I think at some point, when things slow down a little bit, we might take another look at how we are using the database and see if there isn't a better way for us to track certain information. And so she said it very, very well. She made decisions of how to do things based on how they understood the system at the time. As they've used the system and learned more about it and understood how fields and screens relate to each other, they've decided maybe there's a better way of setting this up going forward. And so instead of being angry and saying, why did we make this decision, and boy, aren't we stupid and everything else, she said, we're just going to take the time to look at this and think about, is there a better way to do it? And this is a really good example of where an internal users group will come into play, can come into play very effectively, where you make a decision, you implement that, and weeks later, as we're having these internal user group meetings, we might say, hey, we decided to do it this way, but as a result, it's causing these things to happen. Do we think that's the right approach, or should we actually change how we're doing things? So having the flexibility to, again, acknowledge that the mistake was made and then say, okay, how do we address this? That's what's key to long-term success. All right, number 14, you're in the home stretch. This is one of my very favorite quotes from Thomas Sowell, who is an award-winning economist. He said, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And what he means simply is that every decision has some cost associated with that decision. So for example, in software, the software might be really good, but it's also very expensive. So the trade-off there is, if we want really good software, we have to spend more than maybe we were comfortable with initially. Or maybe the software is really easy to use, but as a result of that, it doesn't actually do everything we need it to do. And again, for some organizations, that's a trade-off we're willing to make because ease of use is more important than having functionality that does everything. But you have to understand what that trade-off is. Or maybe the software does what it needs to do, but the way it does it is really convoluted. And so are we willing to accept that trade-off of that convoluted process, but that actually gets us to where we want to be? Every decision you make comes with a trade-off, and you want to be aware of what you're trading as you make those decisions. So this is a really good example. I talked about indirect costs. Almost by definition, are part of that trade-off discussion. If we're not updating our software now, what's the indirect cost? What's the trade-off for that? Angry staff or upset customers. If we decide to build this new rule that's an exception, what's the cost for that? So understanding what those trade-offs are as you make those decisions is really, really critical. And we have, again, first acknowledged that there is a trade-off, and then secondly say, okay, what are the trade-offs, and are we willing to accept those trade-offs? All right. Arj, if it's okay with you, I'll take one more question before I wrap up.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so we will just probably do that, and we will circle back with those who we do not answer questions from. There's a question here that actually may pertain a little bit more to, I think it was the manage the exceptions, but let's see. It says, is there a good rule of thumb for what percentage of users you should consider small enough not to build the rules around?
Right.
For example, if it affects less than 5%, then don't complicate things by building rules around that group.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say, yeah, rule of thumb for me would be 5 to 10% is probably not worth building around, with this huge caveat. If 5 to 10% is 5 to 10% of 20,000 registrations, then it might actually be worth building, because now we're still talking about 1,000 to 2,000 registrations. But if 5 to 10% is really 50 registrations, then probably we can handle that manually. And so, so there is a bit of a rule of thumb, but we have to understand what that impact is. And so ultimately we have to say, okay, can we address the exception manually, or is that going to be just too onerous? And I think that's the real question to ask, and that, frankly, that's probably the toughest question to answer, because staff might push back and say, why can't we automate this and everything else? And I'm the laziest person in the world. I love automation, but sometimes automation is just too expensive, too difficult to do.
I'm going to shoot one more question your way, just because I think we can get in. But it says, we get lists from affiliates of our organization that we need to put in the database. The problem is that we generate quite a few duplicates by accident. Is there an approach, or how would we go about doing this in the future as a practice?
Yeah, so I think, and that's not an uncommon challenge. And so the key, of course, the programmers will tell you, the key is having a unique identifier that can match those names from your primary system with the names that are being imported, and that's the best way to avoid those duplicates. And if there isn't a unique identifier, then we have to define how we're going to determine potential matches, and then build the process so that we can identify where those potential errors are. But this is a really good example where, again, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If we're able to, so let's say there are 1,000 to import, and we can import 800 of those, and the last 200 have to be done by hand, or we wind up with some duplicates, that's probably still worth doing. In fact, that it's a really good segue into my last rule. And rule number 15 for me is to pursue success and not perfection. And using that example of those imports, if you think about it, what I've found very often with my clients is they'll say, look, we did this import of 1,000 names and we got 25 duplicates, or 100 didn't import or something, and this is just, it's a failure. And my response is, you're kidding, right? Because you imported 900 correctly. So now you're just dealing with those 100 instead of having to deal with 1,000 by hand. And so think about success as your goal and not perfection. In the good old days when we printed directories, there was an aphorism that said the directory is out of date the minute it hits the street. And the reason they would say that, of course, is that in some cases we had collected data 6 months prior to that printed directory being printed. And so in 6 months, obviously things had changed. Well, the reality is your online directory that comes directly from your database, it is out of date also, because things change so rapidly. People die, they change jobs, companies go out of business, new companies come in. That information changes so rapidly that even your online directory can't be perfect. And so that shouldn't be our target. Our target should be being successful. And my hope would be that with these rules, even applying a handful of them at your organization, that you can get closer to the success that you're seeking. So Arj, with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Hey, Wes, I rudely cut you off on that last tip. Could you just repeat it one more time? Because I just want to make sure the audience got that. Just the last tip. I got the explanation.
Okay, that rule number 15, pursue success and not perfection.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good way to get through this. And, sometimes a lot of us compare maintaining a database to almost like maintaining your house. And I'd like to thank you, Wes, for just helping to keep our house in order today.
Sure thing.
Appreciate all those tips. They're just wonderful. And we got some really great questions. I'd like to thank the audience very much for sharing some questions. We're still getting some questions. So again, we'll try to circle back with you. I'd like to leave this information up on the screen right now for you to feel free to contact Wes. I will urge you all, if you don't do it already, to please subscribe to his mailing list, because I look forward to getting his Wes's Wisdom Wednesdays, Wes's Wednesday Wisdoms every Wednesday, and I do read them all. So very great tips, and hey, take what you can get from it and keep this conversation going with this. I'd like to also urge you to download his document that he has generously provided to us. It's in the handouts section of GoToWebinar. With that, Wes, I'd like to thank you again for joining us today and presenting. Really great to have you back in the series, and hopefully we will see you in another event. One last thing, because I felt we have a lot of customers online today. Wanted to let you know that we will be at the CES conference, I think coming up next week. We'll be at the ASA annual meeting in Columbus, as well as Knowledge Days 2020 will be from May 31st to June 2nd.